Captain Dravenkor had known war his whole life. Not the sanitized, bureaucratic war fought by diplomats and bureaucrats in war rooms. The real war. The kind where blood didn't just spill, it soaked the ground. The kind where survival wasn't guaranteed, and you learned to trust no one but the people by your side. It was why he was here now, crouched in the darkness of the ruined space station, a single mission weighing on his shoulders. His fingers gripped the cold, rusted rail as he peered through the cracked viewport. A shimmering, distant fleet of alien warships drifted like a swarm of wasps. Their hulls gleamed in the pale light of the dying star. They'd been waiting, just out of reach. But they weren't the real threat. The real threat was still inside. The station had once been a bustling outpost, home to hundreds of human colonies and their fleets. Now, it was a graveyard. Broken windows, flickering lights, and the faint smell of burning wires filled the air. Humanity had been cut off from the rest of the galaxy, and now Earth was little more than a fading ember in the cold expanse of space. Draven's jaw tightened. There was no coming back from this. "Ready, Captain," came the low voice of Lieutenant Darla Miles, breaking his thoughts. She was crouched next to him, her face illuminated by the glow of her holomap. Her eyes were sharp, focused. "Is the breach team in position?" Draven asked, his voice gravelly. "They're waiting for your go," she replied, her gaze never wavering from the map. The team of infiltrators, clad in stealth suits, was set to infiltrate the Euthurian fleet's auxiliary supply line. A simple mission on paper: sneak in, plant explosives, leave. But there was no such thing as a simple mission in this galaxy, especially when it came to humans. "Once we do this," Draven said, more to himself than to her, "there's no turning back." She nodded, her lips set in a grim line. "I know." The door slid open with a hiss. Commander Tarek was silhouetted in the entryway. Tall, with dark, angular features, his face was etched with the kind of battle-hardened weariness that only comes after years of fighting an enemy who never tired, who never showed mercy. "We're all set, Captain," he said, voice low and controlled. "The station's perimeter is quiet. The Euthurian ships are too far out to stop us, but I don't trust that silence." "I don't trust anything about this," Draven muttered. He'd seen the Euthurian Dominion's tactics. Every move they made was deliberate, calculated. There was no such thing as coincidence in their wars. "We go in fast, hit them hard, and get out. The moment we finish planting those explosives, we're out of here." Tarek inclined his head, a subtle nod. "Understood." Draven turned back to the viewport. The space station's massive bulk hung in the void, silent and decaying. In its prime, it had been a fortress, a symbol of humanity's reach across the stars. Now, it was a hollow tomb. 100 years ago, the Euthurian Dominion had declared humanity's military capabilities too dangerous to the galaxy, enforcing a total ban on human warships and weapons. Any human attempt to fight back, any human act of war, was punished with extinction-level force. Humanity's last defiance had been on the battlefield. Now, humanity fought in the shadows, on the fringes, against impossible odds. "The breach is open," Darla said, tapping her wrist pad. The holomap flickered with the updated coordinates. "Good," Draven muttered. He glanced at his team, 6 strong, each of them veterans of dozens of covert missions. "We move now. Quiet. Fast. We don't give them a chance to react." The crew fell into line behind him, each step heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake. Draven's hand hovered over the rifle slung at his side, fingers twitching as if it might be the last weapon he'd ever use. The last chance for humanity to make its stand. The airlock sealed behind them, and the faint thrum of power pulsed through the walls. A faint blue glow illuminated their path as they made their way through the abandoned hallways, the hum of their boots barely audible against the dead silence of the station. They reached the access shaft, a cramped, metallic tunnel that led to the heart of the Euthurian supply ship. "Remember, we don't have much time," Draven said, his voice tight. "The moment the charges are set, we get out. We're not sticking around to see the fireworks." Tarek gave a low chuckle, the first sound of humor in days. You sure about that, Captain? I thought we were here to make a statement. Draven's eyes narrowed. We're here to survive. A statement won't save us from extinction. They crawled through the shaft, bodies pressed tight against the cold metal. The silence inside was deafening. Draven's mind raced, running through contingencies, anticipating every possible outcome. The plan was simple, but then again, simplicity had a nasty habit of failing when it was needed most. At the end of the shaft, they emerged into the heart of the enemy's supply depot, dark, with only the dim light of emergency strips to illuminate crates of weapons and fuel. The scent of burnt ozone lingered, the bitter aftertaste of a long-forgotten war. The breach team set to work, planting the explosives with precision. Draven's heart pounded in his chest, the ticking clock a constant reminder of how little time they had. He paced, eyes darting over every corner, every shadow. The silence seemed too perfect. Then he heard it, a faint hiss. The breath caught in his throat. Too quiet. Too still. A pulse of warning shot through his spine, his instincts screaming. Something's wrong, Draven muttered, eyes flicking to Darla. Her fingers flew over her wrist pad. I'm getting an alert, someone triggered a silent alarm in the control room. Before Draven could respond, the wall to their right exploded outward in a burst of flame and smoke. A scream ripped through the air as the breach team's point man was thrown back, his body crumpling like paper. Ambush! Tarek shouted, raising his rifle. They knew we were coming. Draven's mind snapped into overdrive, his tactical brain kicking in as adrenaline surged through him. Fall back. Get to the secondary exit, now. The station rumbled around them as the first of the alien soldiers stormed through the smoke, their armor gleaming like polished obsidian. Euthurian war drones, massive, hulking constructs, stepped over the debris, their red eyes fixed on the humans. But Draven didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his rifle spitting fire as he ordered his team to fight through the chaos. There was no time to regroup, no time to question the betrayal that had just occurred. They had one mission now, survive. And humanity's survival depended on it. There's no turning back. Draven Core barely felt the impact when his body hit the cold metal floor of the secondary access corridor. The station's last breath of fire still crackled behind him, and the acrid scent of burnt ozone was thick in the air. His ears rang, and his pulse pounded in his throat, but there was no time to process. No time to mourn the dead. His mind was a machine now, running on nothing but instinct and the cold knowledge that every second counted. Get up. Move, he shouted, pulling himself to his feet, hands shaking slightly. His crew was already up, crouched, ready, their eyes scanning the shadows. The breach team had been scattered, half of them down, but there was no room for hesitation. Tarek was first, his tall frame moving like a predator through the smoke. His rifle, a heavy, military-grade model, was aimed at the still-burning hole where the wall had once stood. What the hell was that, Captain? His voice was harsh, a mixture of anger and disbelief. Draven's jaw clenched. It was a setup. They knew we were coming. Darla, the quiet one, was already working on her wrist pad, fingers flying across the interface. We've been compromised. There's a secondary wave inbound, more Euthurian drones. We're not alone. Draven cursed under his breath. How much time do we have? Less than 5 minutes, maybe less, she replied, her voice unwavering despite the pressure. They're already tracking us through the station's sensors. Damn it. He took a deep breath, pushing the panic down. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting out. He glanced at Tarek and the others. We split up. Tarek, Darla, you're with me. The rest of you head for the backup rendezvous. We'll meet up once we're clear. Tarek gave him a sharp nod. You sure this is the best move? No choice, Draven muttered. We can't all go in one direction. Not with their forces closing in. The team didn't argue. They had no time for that. Everyone knew the drill. Everyone knew how much was riding on this, humanity's last stand. They had to get out. They had to warn the others. But as they moved, every step felt heavier. The sharp hiss of air vents was the only sound in the dead corridor. No alarms blared. No sirens screamed. But Draven knew better than to believe in silence. He could feel the eyes of the enemy on them, lurking in every corner, waiting to pounce. The Euthurian Dominion was a far cry from any enemy they had faced before. Cold, calculating, and always 3 steps ahead. They never underestimated their prey. "Stay sharp," Draven muttered, as they crept forward, weapons drawn, the red glow of emergency lights casting long shadows on the walls. He could almost hear the beating of their hearts, each one racing just as fast as his. They reached the maintenance door. Darla swiped her wrist pad over the keypad. The door slid open with a hiss. Behind it, an old maintenance tunnel stretched into the bowels of the station, thick with rust and grime. The perfect place for an ambush. "Go," Draven whispered, motioning for the team to move inside. He had no idea how long it would take before the Euthurian drones descended on them. His heart beat in his throat, and he could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. Every choice they made from this point on could be their last. The door shut behind them, sealing them into the narrow tunnel. They moved in silence. Each of them was aware of the fragility of the moment, each of them trying to keep their nerves in check. Draven's breath came in slow, controlled bursts as he mentally mapped their route, anticipating every possible risk. Darla moved with precision, her eyes scanning every nook and cranny. She was the tech expert, the one who always knew how to disable or reroute anything in their path. "There's a bypass up ahead," she muttered, voice low but clear. "I can disable their tracking systems, but it'll take a minute." Tarek glanced back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the tension he was holding inside. "Make it fast, Lieutenant. We're running out of time." The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Too many to be a coincidence. Euthurian drones. They had found them. Draven's hand tightened on his rifle, his fingers already moving to activate the charging system. There wasn't much he could do at this point but trust Darla. "Do it now." Darla nodded, her fingers flying over her wrist pad as she worked furiously to override the station's mainframe. A series of sharp beeps rang out in quick succession, followed by a series of colorful lights flickering across the terminal. "It's done," she said, voice tense. "They won't be able to track us through the primary systems." "Good," Draven muttered. "Now, let's move." They continued down the tunnel, their footsteps the only sound, echoing softly in the stagnant air. Draven led, Tarek right behind him, with Darla bringing up the rear. It was a familiar formation, a comfort in the chaos, and for a brief second, he felt like they might actually make it out alive. But just as they neared the end of the maintenance shaft, the shrill sound of a siren cut through the stillness. Draven's pulse spiked. His eyes shot to Darla. "They found us," she hissed, her face pale. "The station's central alarm system just triggered. They're sending in reinforcements. We're not getting out this way." "No, we don't have time to backtrack." Draven's mind raced, locking onto a potential escape route. "There's a decommissioned airlock on the east side. It's been shut down for years, but the bypass might still be functional. We'll take that." Tarek scowled. "You're gambling with our lives." Draven didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice." They reached the junction leading to the airlock. The corridor was dark, only the soft hum of ancient machinery for company. He motioned for Tarek and Darla to move ahead, scanning the shadows. As they reached the final stretch before the airlock, something caught his eye. A glint of red light, a flicker of movement. "Ambush!" Draven shouted, instinct kicking in. He dove for cover just as a pulse of energy sliced through the air where his head had been. The Euthurian drones had arrived, a half-dozen hulking machines, their eyes glowing red with malice. Tarek opened fire, the roar of his weapon echoing through the tunnel, but the drones were already moving, their hulking frames shifting in rapid, terrifying bursts. They were too quick. Too well armed. "Run!" Draven yelled, as he scrambled to his feet. "Move!" Darla was already ahead, her weapon raised as she fired blindly into the advancing horde. Tarek dropped back, covering her six. Draven took a deep breath, heart pounding, and charged forward. There was no turning back now. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was survival. The airlock was only a few meters away, but every step felt like an eternity. Draven's legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, and every part of him screamed to slow down, to catch his breath. But there was no time for that. There was no time for anything except getting out. The drones closed in, their mechanical feet thudding like drums in the silent corridors, faster now. The shriek of their weapons charged the air with deadly intent, and each shot that missed only drove Draven harder. The flickering emergency lights danced in his peripheral vision, casting the hallway in unnatural reds and blues. The pulse of energy from the drones whizzed past, leaving trails of scorched metal in their wake. "Keep moving!" Draven barked, his voice harsh, but cutting through the chaos. "We're almost there." Tarek was already a few steps ahead, his rifle steady as he unleashed a burst of suppressing fire. The heavy-caliber rounds tore through one of the drones, but it wasn't enough. The machines were too many, and they were learning faster than Draven had anticipated. They adjusted, adapted, pushing forward with relentless efficiency. "Incoming, right side!" Darla shouted, pointing down a side hallway. A second wave of drones appeared from the shadows, their red eyes narrowing as they locked onto their targets. The first drone fell with a resounding crash, but the rest moved in without hesitation, their armored bodies impervious to the gunfire. Draven's heart rate spiked. "Damn it," Tarek muttered. "They're too close now." Draven's mind raced. They couldn't afford to waste time fighting. If they did, they'd be trapped in the station with no way out. They had to take the airlock now, no matter what. He glanced at Darla, his eyes locking with hers for a brief second. "Stay behind me," he ordered, voice sharp. Without waiting for a response, he vaulted over the nearest debris, a collapsed console, and sprinted toward the airlock controls. His fingers flew across the manual override panel. Sparks flew as he ripped out a few wires, his movements frantic, desperate. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the overwhelming weight of their circumstances threatening to crush him. The countdown in his mind matched the rapid ticking of the drone's footsteps. 1 minute. Maybe less. He yanked another wire loose, and the airlock's hissing mechanism groaned in protest. It was locked, rusted from years of disuse, and without Darla's technical expertise, they were dead. His hand shook as he connected the bypass unit to the override, hoping that the old systems would respond. "Get it open!" Tarek shouted from behind him, his voice low but filled with urgency. Draven's breath was shallow now, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. "I'm working on it." The sound of the drones grew louder. They were close, too close. Draven could almost hear their mechanical whirring, feel the heat of their weapons. It was no longer just about getting out. It was about surviving long enough to make a difference. The last remnant of humanity couldn't be wiped out here, in the bowels of an abandoned station. Not like this. Come on," he muttered, slamming his fist into the console when the lock didn't give. Then, click. The massive airlock doors groaned open, a flood of fresh oxygen rushing into the dark corridor. Draven didn't wait for the full sequence to finish. He grabbed Darla by the arm and hauled her inside, Tarek right behind them, weapons drawn. The drones were only seconds from the threshold. A violent burst of energy slammed into the side of the airlock, sending sparks flying and rattling the entire structure. Tarek spun, firing off a series of rounds, but the drones were already retreating, moving out of range. "Go!" Draven ordered, his voice hoarse. "Now!" Darla reached for the console inside, her fingers trembling slightly as she activated the manual launch sequence. The airlock hissed again, a deep mechanical groan as the systems kicked into life. The drones had halted at the doorway, their red eyes watching. Silent, calculating. "Launching in 10 seconds, Darla said, voice low and calm despite the chaos. Draven's gaze snapped to Tarek. We hold them here. Tarek nodded, grim determination etched into his features. He stepped forward, rifle at the ready, firing another volley at the drones. The shots landed, but it didn't matter. They didn't need to kill them, just delay them long enough for the airlock to launch. 10 seconds. The airlock doors were closing. The drones advanced again, firing as they moved. Their weapons were as cold and efficient as their movements. Draven could hear the energy builds before the next shot was fired, and the crackle of static before the bolt shot forward, narrowly missing his shoulder. 8 seconds. He squeezed off a few rounds of his own, but his focus wasn't on the drones anymore. His eyes were locked on the airlock console. The final countdown was flashing. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the seconds stretching as if they were hours. 5 seconds. He fired again, this time at the drone closest to them. It faltered, its systems malfunctioning for a split second before it fired back. The blast hit the far wall, sending shrapnel spraying. One piece scraped across Draven's cheek, but he didn't flinch. 3 seconds. Almost there, Darla whispered, her hand hovering over the last sequence. The hum of energy growing louder. The airlock's engines thrummed beneath them, pulling them into the station's external field. 2 seconds. A flash of heat, then the doors sealed shut, and they were thrust into the cold, empty blackness of space. The world went silent. The station's ruins loomed in the distance, like a dying carcass of humanity's past, slowly fading into the darkness. Draven let out a shaky breath, finally allowing himself to relax, if only for a moment. They were alive. But just barely. Status? Draven asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Darla tapped at the console. We're clear. For now. The station's no longer in range. We've got a few hours before the Euthurian fleet can track us again. Tarek leaned against the wall, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was streaked with blood, his clothes torn, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. We made it. Against all odds, we made it. Draven didn't smile. Not yet. The battle wasn't over. The war wasn't over. And they hadn't won. But they'd live to fight another day. Get us to the rendezvous, Draven said. We've got a message to send. And as the airlock sealed behind them, and the stars stretched out before them, he knew that the fight had only just begun. Humanity was not finished yet. The silence in the cockpit was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the ship's engines and the distant rumble of the breach alarms. Draven sat in the pilot's seat, staring out at the black void ahead, his knuckles white around the controls. They were far from the wreckage of the station, but the echoes of their escape still pulsed in his mind. The fight for survival had only just begun. Darla was in the seat next to him, hunched over her console, tapping through a series of encryption protocols. Tarek leaned against the bulkhead, his arms folded across his chest, eyes flicking from one of them to the other. We can't stay here forever, he said, voice flat but laced with an edge of frustration. We need to contact command. Let them know what happened. Draven's jaw tightened. Not yet. We need to keep low, or we'll lead the whole Euthurian fleet straight to their doorstep. I didn't sign up for a slow death, Tarek shot back, pushing off from the wall and striding toward the cockpit. We can't just hide in space. We don't have the firepower, and you know it. I know, Draven muttered, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. But we also don't have the luxury of rushing in blind. We need information, resources. We need to know who's still out there and what the hell happened to our fleet. The ship's artificial intelligence, a calm and emotionless voice, suddenly piped in over the comms. Approaching the edge of the outer system. Estimated time to rendezvous with the fleet, 5 hours. Darla didn't look up from her console. We're already outside Euthurian sensor range. They won't be able to track us unless we get too close to one of their ships, or if we do something stupid. Tarek snorted. Like what? Put up a flare and scream, come get us? Exactly, Draven said, the edge of a grim smile on his lips. If we make noise, they'll know exactly where to find us. We'll survive longer if we stick to the plan, Darla added, her fingers still working through the data, extracting what she could from the station's internal systems. We need to find out why they attacked us, what they're really after. The Dominion didn't just come in like that for no reason. I'm with you on that, Tarek grumbled. But I'm not getting any younger here, Captain. Sooner or later, we need to hit back. Draven ignored him, focusing on the long-range scan. His thoughts were elsewhere, his mind racing through the puzzle of their survival. There was a larger game being played here, and humanity was a mere pawn caught in the middle of it. The Euthurian Dominion didn't wipe out humanity's last station for just a random strike, they had been expecting them. Someone had sold them out. Anything? He asked Darla. She shook her head. Just scraps. Security logs, fragmented data. Looks like someone wiped their mainframe right after the breach. I'm going to need more time to decrypt the files. I might be able to piece together something if we hit one of their relay stations. Draven leaned back in the chair, his gaze flickering back to Tarek. And we'll have to hit them hard. If we don't, the whole damn fleet will be on us. I didn't say we had to walk in with a white flag, Tarek muttered, a hint of fire in his tone. But we can't keep running. It's not about survival anymore, it's about taking the fight back to them. That's not the plan, Draven snapped, his voice cold. He stood up from the seat, the weight of his decision settling in the pit of his stomach. We hit the relays. We get what we can. And then we find out who betrayed us. Tarek didn't argue, though the tension in the room remained palpable. His loyalty had always been to the fight. To the idea of a swift, direct retaliation. But Draven knew better. A direct strike now would be suicide. The Dominion was too powerful, too organized. They had to outsmart them. They had to find the cracks, the fractures in their perfect armor. And Draven would find them. The hours dragged on, the long stretches of silence broken only by the occasional hum of the ship's systems or the soft tapping of Darla's fingers. But as the rendezvous point loomed closer, the air between them thickened with unspoken tension. No one spoke of what might be waiting when they finally arrived. No one spoke of the desperation in their ranks, the growing realization that their time was running out. The ship lurched, the sudden gravitational pull of a nearby planet yanking Draven out of his thoughts. His fingers tightened on the controls, steadying the ship as they adjusted their course. Warning, the AI's voice piped up. Entering the gravity well of a Class B gas giant. Adjusting trajectory for the rendezvous. The ship groaned as the engines kicked into high gear. The artificial gravity kicked in, and Draven felt the weight shift under his feet. The familiar pressure of the ship's stabilizers helped ease the tension in his chest. Perfect, Tarek muttered, glancing out of the viewport at the massive swirling gas clouds below. A gas giant. Real cozy place to park a fleet. I don't think the fleet is here, Darla interjected, her eyes narrowing at the console. The signals from the fleet are too scattered. It's like they've been moved. Moved? Draven's voice was sharp, the words slicing through the air like a dagger. Moved where? Not sure yet, Darla replied, her fingers flying over the console, trying to lock in a more precise location. But it's definitely not where the fleet was supposed to be. Draven's stomach twisted. We've been led into a trap. Tarek's eyes flashed, a glint of fury in them. So this wasn't just a failed ambush. They're pulling strings. Someone's orchestrating this. Exactly, Draven said, clenching his jaw. And that means they've been expecting us. There was a long, heavy silence in the cockpit. Each of them understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. It wasn't about simple survival. There were forces at play, forces larger than they had ever imagined. And they were being swept up in the undertow. What now? Tarek asked, his voice steady but edged with a quiet anticipation. Draven didn't hesitate. His mind was already moving, already calculating their next steps. He glanced at Darla, who had already mapped the area ahead, her face drawn in concentration. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, Draven ordered. We're not going in blind. We're getting answers, even if we have to rip them from the enemy's teeth. As the ship sliced through the atmosphere of the gas giant, heading for a rendezvous that might not even exist, Draven knew one thing for sure: they were about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. The fight for humanity's future had begun, and they were the last line of defense. There was no turning back now.